And now, circling back to the nuclear question, and I, Pascal, I would have never uttered these words even a week ago. But now I'm not entirely sure that the option of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon to end this war that's not going to Putin's plan quickly and on Russian terms, I'm not entirely convinced that that is such an inconceivable notion anymore.
Oh my God, I am very unhappy that you're saying that. Welcome, everybody. I'm here today with Mariana Budjeryn. Mariana is a research associate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center, where she's working on a project called Managing the Atom. She formerly was a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow, a fellow at the Harvard Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, and a visiting professor at Tufts University and at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Mariana's research focus on the international non-proliferation regime, arms control, and post-Soviet nuclear history. Her analytical contributions appeared in many major academic and popular journals. Furthermore, Mariana has a book forthcoming with the title Inheriting the Bomb: The Collapse of the USSR and the Nuclear Disarmament of Ukraine, scheduled to appear this year. As you might guess, Mariana is Ukrainian and a Ukrainian nuclear specialist. And it is in times like these when suddenly this theoretical knowledge of us academics becomes very relevant. So she's giving a lot of interviews at the moment. And naturally, we are here in sad times. Actually, we scheduled this meeting before the invasion happened, and now it's 1 week in and Europe is at war again. Your country is being attacked, Mariana. And I've talked to other specialists before, among others, the last US ambassador to the USSR, Jack Matlock, and they have all been quite adamant about the point that NATO and the West made severe mistakes when dealing with Russia. And I know that you also have extensively researched the topics. I really wanted to talk to you also as a Ukrainian who's directly impacted by the entire situation. And we will go through this step by step, but let's maybe start with a personal question. Mariana, how are you? How's your family doing? You're from Kiev, if I'm not wrong, or give us the background.
Yes, thank you so much for asking that. I am born in Ukraine, raised there. I did my undergraduate degree in Kiev, as you mentioned, but I'm originally from a western city of Lviv. It's in western Ukraine, closer to the Polish border. And I do still have family there. I'm an only child of a single mother, so my mother is there alone in Lviv. There's some extended family as well. But how am I? I'm incredibly worried. I'm worried for my mother and her safety. Western Ukraine has been so far spared. The kinds of aerial attacks and bombings and missile attacks as the cities in Western and Southern Ukraine, in Eastern and Southern Ukraine, but we really don't know what Putin's plans are for Ukraine. And I worry about my family, but also I worry about my country. It is a time that it finds itself now in what we in academia casually throw around and call as existential threat. Ukraine is up against great odds. It's a second largest army in the world that has attacked Ukraine, and it's a nuclear power. And I think that element of it is going to be quite relevant for our conversation today. The whole nuclear history of Soviet collapse and Ukraine's Soviet disarmament is now sort of coming up and bubbling up and becoming very, very relevant, not just for what's going on in Ukraine today and the threats that Ukraine faces, but also, I dare say, for the entire credibility and the health of international non-proliferation regime that has been constructed so painstakingly over decades with the purpose of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons around the world.
Yeah, I maybe need to add that we met also at the non-proliferation conference, right? Because you are one of the #1 experts actually in the US on Ukrainian denuclearization. The special thing about Ukraine is that it gave up the nuclear weapons that it had on its territory. That is, well, others former Soviet states did that too. And maybe let me add one more thing, that both of us were born in a different Europe, right? It's maybe also relevant, especially for us historians, to just recall that you were born a citizen of the Soviet Union, right?
Absolutely, yes.
How old were you when the Soviet Union collapsed? I'm sorry for the question, but
no, there's no shame in that. I was 16 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed, so I remember quite well the Soviet times. My entire sort of high school or secondary education career was in the Soviet in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet system. And I also remember, as a student of political science in Kyiv in the early 90s, paying attention to these debates over Ukraine's nuclear inheritance and the stalwart insistence of the United States and Russia that joined arms at that time to insist that only one nuclear weapon state could emerge from the Soviet collapse. So even though this nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union, collapsed into 15 constitutive states, and 4 of those had Soviet nuclear arms in their territory, in order to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons from the very logical and understandable standpoint of nuclear non-proliferation, the United States and supported by the international community, by all of its allies, very quickly formulated a policy stance that only one nuclear state should emerge from the Soviet collapse, and that in uncertain terms that should be Russia was beyond dispute, for a number of reasons, including the fact that the Soviet Union was a nuclear weapon state under the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that recognized, again, only 5 nuclear possessors, the sort of legitimate, recognized nuclear states, of course, couched or conditioned on their agreement to ultimately, per Article 6 of that treaty, to pursue nuclear disarmament. But so it was almost like an org chart, there were 5 boxes, and one box sort of became temporarily messy and empty, as it were. And only one state could be plugged into that box, the one of the 5. So that went uncontested for all the kind of understandable reasons. However, the status and kind of the fate of nuclear weapons in other Soviet successor states, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, became a matter of contestation. Because of course, Russia insisted at that time that it were Russian weapons situated in Ukraine, very much like, American weapons are stationed in Turkey and in Germany and in Belgium and elsewhere. But Ukraine especially contested that claim. It said, no, we were part of the Soviet Union. We contributed to the Soviet nuclear program, just like everybody else. Our resources, our human resource, natural resources. Ukraine was home to the world's largest ICBM factory in Dnipro. Now it's Dnipro, it used to be Dnipropetrovsk. So one of the 3 main design bureaus for the ICBMs that carried nuclear weapons was also in Ukraine. So the Pivden Design Bureau and Pivdenmash, also known by Russian names of Yuzhny and Yuzhmash. And there was a lot of expertise, not just the weapons, but there were parts of the weapons complex that produced this deterrent. And Ukraine made a quite kind of a recalcitrant stand to challenge this claim of Russian monopoly on Soviet nuclear inheritance. And in a sense, so it was successful because it did sort of get a nuclear deal, right? And then with getting a nuclear deal, there was a recognition that these were the weapons that belonged to Ukraine in some sense, and that Ukraine was giving up something that had belonged to Ukraine and was getting compensated for it.
That's the Budapest Memorandum, right, of 1994, that Russia acknowledges the borders and the security of Ukraine in return for Ukraine then giving up the nuclear arsenal, and also Ukraine then getting access to the NPT framework so that you can use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, right? So.
Correct. So the Budapest Memorandum, the so-called Budapest Memorandum, its name is Memorandum on Security Assurances to Ukraine in connection with its accession to the NPT. That was part of the deal. Another part was a financial part, was a compensation for the fissile material contained in Ukrainian warheads. There was highly enriched uranium, there was plutonium, and that was negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, but also facilitated by the United States. So basically, the United States advanced some kind of money to Russia to compensate that Ukraine in kind. In the compensation took the form of fuel assemblies for Ukrainian power stations.
So this was really great power cooperation in denuclearizing Ukraine and convincing Ukrainians also on a political level to actually give it up.
Correct, correct. So let me just say that there is a misperception that Ukraine somehow unproblematically possessed nuclear weapons. And that is not exactly right. Ukraine was a home to this, world's third largest kind of arsenal of nuclear weapons. But Ukraine did not have the command and control over these weapons. That command and control rested solely in Moscow at that time. Eventually, Ukrainian president acquired a sort of capacity to block a launch from Ukrainian territory. That was an issue at that time because Ukrainian leaders said, wait a minute, how is it that we have these weapons and we have no say in how they are used? What if there's a launch from our territory, inadvertent or otherwise, we become a target? That is not a good deal for us. So there was a procedure that was instituted between the commander of the ICBM army, of the missile army, that was headquartered in Ukraine, and Ukrainian president, that should this commander receive a launch order from Moscow, he had to consult with the Ukrainian president. It wasn't exactly the control, it was more sort of the command part of the arrangement, so sort of the soft,
a bit of a veto.
A bit of a veto power, and it relied entirely on the loyalty, right, of the commander to actually go and consult the Ukrainian president. But there was a small faction of Ukrainian kind of political sphere in this kind of lobby that actually did consider establishing such a command and control over the arms in Ukraine, simply because there was, there were the capacities to do so between the missile factory and between other enterprises that are situated in Kharkiv that design guidance systems and targeting systems for a different kinds of ICBM. So there was sort of the science and the industry. It would have taken an effort. It was not an easy thing, right? It would have taken doing and investing into this.
But the hardware was there.
The many of the elements were there. So what I like to think of it as a kind of handsome proliferator starter package, right? If we look at countries like North Korea or Pakistan, and see how, you know, they go and pursue these technologies in illicit ways over decades. They haunt, you know, they get scientists, they get them educated, they bring them back, they buy some kind of parts from Switzerland or elsewhere, and you know, or the whole wide world. They procure these technologies at such great you know, effort and expense. Well, in Ukraine, a lot of it was already there, right? And the reason why Ukrainians did not in earnest consider actually going, you know, exercising these capacities and going with the nuclear option were twofold. And one was the economic cost, right? So Ukraine was lacking in basically the entire nuclear fuel cycle. It had the uranium ore and milling, so mining and milling. It had kind of the raw material for fissile material, for kind of the ore for fissile material, but it lacked the enrichment and reprocessing capacity and, you know, the making of the fuel. And then you had to actually have a warhead lab that would design and build a warhead. Again, there were scientists that with clearances in Soviet nuclear program, there were scientists who, you know, most likely knew how to do it and could probably have figured it out sooner than, say, North Korean scientists, but it would have taken an investment in a fully fledged nuclear program. That was not negligible in economic terms, given that Ukraine was, you know, going through a pretty stark economic times of this post-Soviet transition when inflation was through the roof, 10,000%. So Ukraine was in a very hard economic position, and it also needed Western support, you know, the money from IMF, from the World Bank, for stabilization funds, right, to stabilize its economy, to introduce its own currency and so forth. And in connection with that, sort of the second reason why Ukraine did not in earnest consider or pursue this nuclear option was exactly the international political consequences that would have ensued. And it was not only kind of the threat of sanctions or isolation, it was in very real sense the kind of country Ukraine wanted to become. It did not want to become the North Korea of Eastern Europe, defying the international community, not joining the NPT. You know, it was an aspiring democracy that just emerged from this evil empire, right? It was trying to join the international community of democratic states on good terms. And of course, you know, going nuclear was not exactly a way to win friends and influence people on the international arena.
Thank you very much for that explanation. And I have two connected questions, and both of them are kind of polemic, but I want to ask them anyhow. The first one, and this is maybe as straightforward as I can say, is like, okay, we have a process in which Ukraine was denuclearized, got security agreements, democratized, etc. And then things went south. Where and when, according to your view, did we fuck it up? By we, I mean we Europeans, you know, we're all Europeans, and I don't think you can put blame on one party only. There's always action and reaction. Where did we start fucking it up? Why is it war now? Secondly, Ukraine denuclearized. Was that a mistake, looking at the situation now? And please give us your opinion.
So I'll take the second question first because it's kind of more straightforward to me to answer. No, it was not a mistake. Ukraine did the right thing. It did the right thing for itself, and it did the right thing for the international security, right? We know, you know, that nuclear weapons, more nuclear weapons in the world, I mean, many of us believe, including myself, will not contribute to a better and more equitable and a just world, right? So Ukraine did the right thing. It also sort of, by making this decision, it recommended itself, it constructed itself into a kind of state that, you know, that it wanted to become. It kind of went hand in hand. And by that time, you know, it wasn't, it wasn't the France of Eastern Europe. It could never have become that kind of analogy, not in the early 90s. By the early 90s, it would have become a pariah state and chose not to do it. Now, the way things have developed since, to come to your first question, is they're sort of risking of proving Ukraine wrong, and we do not want to do that. Right, there is already this popular narrative that I'm picking up every time I go back home, and I sort of just casually ask people or overhear things. I have my ear tuned into these nuclear things, and the general sort of narrative, a very simplistic narrative to be sure, is that we had nuclear weapons, we gave them up for nothing, and now look what happened. From a standpoint of a scholar, of course, I could start educating people and saying, listen, it wasn't like we had nuclear weapons. We had an option of keeping them, but that was a costly option, right? That was not really a good option. It was not an easy option for us, right? But this is, or that, we didn't give him up for nothing. There was compensation. There was compensation in, in the form of the fuel, but also this Budapest Memorandum. And it's not a worthless piece of paper, not in my opinion. But these things are difficult to explain in so much nuance, right? And they don't make good political slogans. Complicated histories normally don't. So it is unfortunate. And I think what could have been done differently to not yield that kind of narrative in Ukrainian public sphere, and to actually make things also better for the international non-proliferation scene, are two things. One, there was a missed opportunity with the Budapest Memorandum. We are talking now all about Ukrainian neutrality, we're talking about Finlandization and things like that. Even before the invasion, that was already too little, too late. If there was a serious opportunity to get Ukraine some kind of guaranteed neutrality, then the 1994 Budapest Memorandum was it. And this is exactly what Ukraine had negotiated for. It did not want to become, member of NATO. It just said, all right, our security is in peril. We're giving up an asset that has some security value, right? We might not control it, but we could try, right? We're giving it up. We want some kind of guarantees that, our security will not be in peril as a result of it. And what Ukraine got in return, as you noted earlier, was kind of a restatement of literally copy-paste clauses from the UN Security Charter, from the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, kind of the general assurances reconfirming obligations to respect sovereignty, international recognized borders, not to apply economic coercion, and as you know, the positive and negative NPT-related nuclear security assurances, not to threaten Ukraine with nuclear weapons, and should such threat arise, to seek action at the UN Security Council. It was not that it was done in a kind of non-legally binding form. I mean, we know that in international relations, all sorts of commitments, even political commitments, they stand, and even legally binding commitments get broken, right? There isn't an enforcer, right? It's more about how states interpret and internalize their obligations under different commitments. There wasn't any sanction, there wasn't any costs imposed for any of the parties for breaching it, not even sort of in a suggestive way, if not legally binding way. So the only thing that was put in place was a consultation mechanism of the parties should issues arise in connection with the memorandum. Ukrainians at the time actually did mention the precedent of the Austria State Treaty, right? They said, how about we do something like that? We say, okay, we remain neutral, we don't join, one way or the other, but there has to be some kind of guarantee to that. It is hard to know if anything like that would have worked, right? Maybe that would have been a more robust arrangement for Ukraine, but maybe even that wouldn't have been sufficient, because it seems to me that the instances of this kind of neutrality worked when an object or a country that is being in this way neutral is of no great importance to either of the side. So the most important thing is that that country doesn't join the other camp. Otherwise, it can be left alone. But you are more of a neutrality specialist than me to see if that holds. For Ukraine, it seems that Russia has a particularly strong interest in that country for whatever reason, historical, cultural, political. It just cannot stand the idea of Ukraine making its own inroads and deciding its own fate. It's like an eyesore, at least for the current Russian regime, for the current Russian leadership. So I do remain, that it would have helped, probably. It would have helped, kind of give Ukraine some kind of basis and security, and maybe stop it from seeking NATO membership eventually. If that was kind of this kind of treaty. But at that time, we were friends with Russia. We thought Russia was going to be a nice state. It was going to join the West, and we were all going to sit around and sing Kumbaya. And the utility and the importance of nuclear weapons was waning. There was all sorts of arms control treaties, and that kind of went. The kind of Cold War mentality, fortunately, went away, right? And then it was resurrected back, by I would say Putin's leadership, Putin and the Kremlin, and the NATO enlargement certainly did not help, but aggravated things. Although I'm not the one who, I'm not saying that it was wrong. It just Ukraine was then trapped between sort of an enlarged NATO and an aggravated revisionist Russia that was pissed off at NATO enlargement, and Ukraine was left in this power vacuum, right?
These two issues are intimately connected: denuclearization and the neutrality status. The important thing to know is that until 2014, Ukraine had a neutrality law or article in its in its setup. I'm not sure anymore if it was in the constitution or if it was just a law article, but that was then gotten rid of after the invasion of Crimea, right? Which
exactly.
Which itself kind of was a reaction on the NATO kind of throwing an eye on Ukraine, and so you see this spiral going up, and now we've got war.
And now we got war, and I think NATO, the aggravation of the NATO enlargement, is perhaps part of the story, and it's giving a good reason, a sort of a justification or a reason that is being thrown around in the Russian public sphere and by President Putin. But there's also another element. If you read closely this essay, this really long essay that Putin wrote in July about Ukraine, if you read closely, even Medvedev, the former president of Russia, Medvedev, he wrote, published an article in Kommersant in October, I think, something about how it's impossible to negotiate with Ukrainian leadership, that they're kind of not a non-state, that Ukraine has no political tradition, that Ukraine's Jewish president, president of Jewish origin, now speaks Ukrainian and he doesn't even know who he is. And that's like, he likened it to a collaboration of a Jewish leader with the Nazis. It's just these incredibly like outlandish things. And what I'm reading, what I'm hearing in this discourse that's coming out from Moscow is this really kind of deep-seated contempt or some kind of resentment of Ukraine as a project. And NATO might be a part of it, but a lot of that bile is really directed at Ukraine as a political project itself, right? NATO or not. So I was on an NPR program recently with a correspondent who was reporting from Kyiv, and he's a war correspondent. He was reported from the Russian-Georgian War in 2008, and now he's in Kyiv, and he's a Black man, and he says, and I'm glad it was him who enunciated it. He said, the kind of things that Kremlin is saying about the Ukrainians, if they were said in the West about any one group about another, they would be considered deeply racist and deeply chauvinistic and deeply bigoted. We do not, because kind of this racism exists in terms of skin color in the United States and a lot of times in the West, we forget that the inventors of racism, that kind of racism, or the regime that really, prosecuted this or took this racism to this inconceivable sort of end, it was the Nazi regime. They were racist against people of the same kind of color, but of a different sort of ethnic, as it were, origin. So there is kind of this element of really kind of superiority. And I think we see this playing out now in a really dangerous way, because it seems that that attitude had led the Russian leadership to greatly underestimate the Ukrainian defenses and the resistance they would face in Ukraine from people. I mean, we see the images on TV and on social media. I mean, everyone, men, woman, and child, are hurling insults at the Russian occupiers and then standing up for it, for their country. And now, because he's so vested in this war, right? His reputation is on the line. He could have done many different things. He could have just annexed the self-declared republics, could have recognized them, annexed them like he did Crimea. That would not have precipitated that kind of outcry as we see today. But he went for really, the very maximalist approach. And now, circling back to the nuclear question, and Pascal, I would have never uttered these words even a week ago, but now I'm not entirely sure that the option of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon to end this war that's not going to Putin's plan quickly and on Russian terms, I'm not entirely convinced that that is such an inconceivable notion anymore.
Oh my God, I am very unhappy that you're saying that. Where would that even make sense? Strategic nuclear weapons are those with which you want to wipe out entire cities and industrial centers. Tactical nuclear weapons are those that you want to use in precision in order to wipe out a very important military facility for tactical reasons. Where in Ukraine would a tactical strike even make sense? I mean, you cannot take out Kiev, you cannot take out the center of power because you need it in order to negotiate the surrender.
I mean, all the nuclear scenarios sound crazy, right? I mean, the utility of nuclear weapons as a war-fighting instrument is really circumspect, but
there's people who believe they're useful. That's the problem.
Exactly, that's the problem. I mean, the targeting here would be secondary. The significance of the target would be secondary. What would be significant is the crossing of that line, the breaking of the taboo, and the making of the statement that Russia is vested in this. And, again, creating, I mean, can you imagine what happens if even a small nuclear weapon is detonated anywhere? I mean, it is destruction, it is fallout, it is all sorts of, just the psychological impact of it would be huge. It would be enormously disruptive. So that could bring, just shock this war into a halt. And, I sound as some kind of like crazy, utopian doomsday sayer, but I swear, this is what we're seeing coming out of Kremlin is really it doesn't make that much sense. It's not a rational behavior that the way we see it, the way we understand it. It was made very explicitly to Putin how severe the economic consequences of the invasion would be. And again, it seems that he had underestimated the Western resolve, the kind of unity and solidarity that we're seeing today. And Russia will hurt really badly from these economic sanctions. And not in some unspecified future, there's already signs of this economic pressure on ordinary Russians. And more importantly, there's clamping down on any kind of dissent as well.
And the point is, Russia is clearly said it's willing to take these economic costs, right? On the other hand, and that's what gives me hope that it doesn't go, Ukraine can go either of two ways. Either things get better and we get to a peace agreement of some sort, or it goes even worse. And if it goes worse, it can become an Afghanistan of Europe. That would be horrible. Unfortunately, there's forces working on that as well. Arming Ukraine, for example, I think will rather push towards this scenario, but we don't need to go there. The thing that gives me hope is the Ukrainian and Russian forces managed Chernobyl even during a war. You managed to actually agree that this thing needs to be handled like a raw egg, which it is, right? And the other thing is that Russia seems, at least on the outside, to try to avoid civilian casualties as much as you can in a situation like this. But I
would have to disagree with you on the later one. That was the initial strategy, right? The initial strategy was to go in with small groups, kind of surgically. They thought they would get to Kiev in 3 days, and then, install their own government, their own leadership. That has failed. Since that has failed, there have been a wanton airstrikes on civilian residential parts of Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and even Kiev. In Kiev, they're kind of trying to target civilian infrastructure, not buildings. But Kharkiv is getting demolished. The images coming from there are terrible, and so is Chernihiv. Those are the cities kind of close to the Russian border in the north. In the northeast. And, we need to recall the way Russia treated Chechnya in the Second Chechnya War in 1999. That was exactly their strategy. There was no discrimination. They wanted to beat the population into submission, right? So I do not see that much discrimination right now in Russian targeting, or at least it's increasingly indiscriminatory. And again, I share your worry that, this is not going to Putin's plan, and he is putting, his face is on the line, his reputation is on the line. He cannot be seen as losing to Ukrainians, right? Or Ukrainians thwarting his plans. So this is a very dangerous situation indeed. We all need to think very hard how to find off-ramps, but of course, no matter, try though we might, it is all predicated on Putin wanting to take an off-ramp.
Okay, because unfortunately we are already running out of time, but I have two things left. One, I read just this morning that the spy chief of Russia actually said that Ukraine was quite advanced in the nuclear technology it possesses and could very quickly develop nuclear weapons. The Russians try to build up this scenario of Ukraine is at the brink of getting nuclear weapons again. So you're the expert on this. Can you tell us if there's any rationality or truth to this? Secondly, Mr. Putin has 3 demands: demilitarization, denazification, and neutralization of Ukraine. And this Sergei, the spy chief, again uttered it this morning. Ukraine needs to be neutral. So it brings us back to what we talked about earlier. Denazification is probably the demand for regime change. And demilitarization is just like, do not be a military threat, right? I mean, no nuclear weapons, no stationing, etc., etc. Can you respond to that?
Right. So
Or is
on the
that an
nuclear
offer?
weapons, on the nuclear weapons, this is, of course, is all, I mean, trumped up and has no basis in reality. Ukraine was closer to any sort of nuclear bomb or nuclear program back in 1991, when it just, inherited these weapons. It had the weapons on its territory. It had the fissile material. It had, still the scientists who knew how to do it. There was a lot of institutional forgetting that happened through that. And of course, Ukraine is under IAEA safeguards. Its nuclear infrastructure is incredibly transparent. There are no industrial reactors or even enrichment facilities in which nuclear material can be diverted to military purposes. And it's, again, entirely transparent to the IAEA and the nuclear its inspectors. So, this is just another dud pretext that would be trumped up to justify an invasion. And funny enough, it's coming from the same people that said, oh, Ukraine was like, Ukrainians had nothing to do with those nuclear weapons that they inherited. They weren't they wouldn't know how to handle them. It was like a monkey with a grenade was the phrase back then. So it was like the earth opened, Ukrainians came out and they saw these nuclear weapons and they thought, oh, what are these things? What do we do with them? Which of course was also untrue. The truth is always more complicated and somewhere in the middle. But now it's a 180 turnaround to say, oh no, actually they're really advanced in these nuclear in this nuclear research. That's just a lie. In terms of denazification, I mean, what can one comment? This is actually quite offensive that something like that should be thrown around. And I think the international community really should make a statement, because you do not, throw words like genocide or accuse people of being Nazis just casually like that, or for these sort of purposes. I think we all remember the history of what that was really like, and that's very offensive to the actual Nazi victims and the actual victims of genocide. And neutralization is, I think there probably is some kind of creative solution to that problem that would perhaps work for both Ukrainians and Russians. I'm not super optimistic. But I think after such a large-scale invasion, to kind of try and demilitarize Ukraine, and I think demilitarization, it doesn't mean just no nuclear weapons and no stationing. It means, demolishing Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, Ukraine is not, by any stretch of imagination, could have been a threat to a military power like Russia. So this is, these are sort of very non-starter positions that, the West did not provide one piece of offensive weaponry to Ukraine before this invasion. All Ukraine had was javelins. And Stingers came in even later. Stingers came in when the first Stingers arrived when the hostilities started, if I'm not mistaken, or very, very close before that, but not much. There's no, air defense systems per se. I mean, Stingers is something to take out military helicopters. They won't reach to even the Air Force, right? Ukraine has a very weak Air Force and very weak air defenses. And how else would you demilitarize Ukraine? To what? To handguns?
That's the point. The situation we reach now is you're fighting more about words than anything else. Japan was demilitarized after the Second World War, and its military was completely dismantled and then replaced by self-defense forces. And today's Japan self-defense forces are a pretty large and well-equipped army, but they're still self-defense forces. Therefore, nobody perceives them as threatening, or very little. I don't know if that is a way forward, but it is listening to
that
how
is
well
a way forward if you know, Russia is willing to become to Japan what the United States was willing to become. I mean, Russia is willing to become to Ukraine what the United States was willing to become to Japan. Let it, you know, run and you know, decide its own affairs and even provide some kind of measure of security to Japan. In return, I mean, these countries are now partners and allied. I mean, the United States did not want to, you know, annex Japan and make it part of its territory and leave it completely bereft of sovereignty. I mean, after the kind of the occupation administration or something left. So, you know, I hope there is a diplomatic solution out of it. I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet, though. It's going to get worse before it's going to get better.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Mariana, because as being from the country that this concerns, this is just heartbreaking. And it's just, Europe is such a stupid continent, I just must say again. We do this on a basis by decade. Every goddamn decade, we do this again. And unfortunately, it's Ukraine this time. I'm very sorry about that. I do hope that we get out of it. And I hope to talk to you again. I know you have to leave. Thank you very much for taking the time and giving us these insights. I'll be in touch with you again shortly.
Thank you so much for having me. And it was a pleasure talking with you.
Talk to you very soon. And goodbye, Mariana.
Bye.
Bye.